The moon. Have you ever really wondered about the moon? Of course we know it controls the oceans. But what other things? What hidden things could there be? Things that date back to before the human race was even making simple tools. I've heard many say that they believe the moon causes strange, unexplainable changes in human behavior. But who can we believe? What is the truth? In my quest for truth, I've come up with some pretty interesting answers. But first, some history. No one really knows how the moon formed, but there are several theories. One being the collision or impact theory. In this theory, a large body the size of Mars hit Earth as the solar system was forming. When it collided, it caused the surface to flash boil and melt. Because the collision still had some energy, a remnant, the moon, flung off from the Earth. It then cooled and collected all the craters it has today. Mind you, it's only a theory. Of course, all modern knowledge of the moon stemmed from Galileo Galilei. His eyes were the first to peer through a telescope and look at the moon. His first crude telescope had a power of 20. The moon would have looked like this, small and blurry. But he was still able to map the moon and show that it was more than just a round, flat, perfect sphere. His ideas challenged the church, and he was labeled a heretic. This is because up until then, all heavenly spheres were considered to be perfect, just as God is. The moon, as Galileo saw it, was full of mountains and valleys, which are drastically imperfect. But when more and more people began to look through his telescope and see it for their own eyes, his ideas soon became widely accepted. He made many more celestial discoveries, such as the moons of Jupiter and the rings on Saturn, which he believed were ears. But these helped pave the way towards the future in space technology. Nearly 1 universal second passed, and the human race was sending a man to the very thing at which Galileo could only look.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
At last, the laws of Newton and Kepler were finally being proven in their truest sense. But I think one of the more important changes that it brought on in the world was the sense of accomplishment that it gave to the human race. It's best summed up by a speech Walter Cronkite made right after the landing.
In these 8 days of the Apollo 11 mission, the world was witness to not only the triumph of technology, but to the strength of man's resolve and the persistence of his imagination. Through all time, the moon has endured out there, pale and distant, determining the tides, tugging of the heart, a symbol, a beacon, a goal.
9.5, 30 seconds forward. Hey, contact light. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Now man has prevailed. He's landed on the surface of the moon, he's stabbed into its crust, he's stolen some of its soil to bring back in a tiny treasure ship, perhaps unlock some of its secrets.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The date's now indelible. It's going to be remembered as long as man survives. July 20th, 1969, the day man reached and walked on the moon.
Although it was a cornerstone event in our history, it was very short, for as soon as they arrived, they left one day later.
And if anyone were to ask me how I could describe this flight, I can only say that it was absolutely out of this world.
Man's dream and a nation's pledge have now been fulfilled.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
So what exactly does the full moon do to us? Two scientists, Ivan Kelly and Roger Culver, looked over 100 studies on lunar effects and found there is no significant relation between the full moon and anything from the homicide rate to psychiatric admissions. Why is it then that so many people still believe the full moon has strange powers? I believe there are several reasons. The first reason is that anything that appears remotely scientific is easily believed by the public. Some people say gravity or the amount of light we see could be the culprit, but the real science shows an increase in gravity to be that of the force of a mosquito, and that the increase in luminosity is not a major difference in the average person's world. We receive more light looking at a streetlight than we do the moon. Also, the tides seem to be an enormous force, but in actuality they are very weak forces acting over a large mass of water. Secondly, folklore has great influence on how we think of confusing things. Many fictional stories we hear as children and media we absorb as adults all reinforce the ancient lunar folklore. One should note that the Latin word for moon is luna, where we get the word lunatic in modern English. But the biggest reason for this superstition lies upon its communal support. People have heard it so many times from police officers, nurses, doctors, and social workers that they often select what they will pay attention to. People will then notice strange things because it is a full moon and ignore them when it is not, which in turn causes them to be even more believing of the phenomenon. Over time, our memories become selective and distorted, and we become convinced that the full moon has powers over us, when it is actually our own superstition that overpowers our reason and logic. How did all of this come about, you wonder? We will never know for sure, but I propose that it started when humans first roamed the earth. Everyone lived outside at first, and it must have appeared rebellious for the moon to show its light when it should have been dark. These questions may eventually be answered, but for now one question is answered. The full moon is not the reason for strange events. Rather, it is the human imagination inspired by the moon that gives us such a mysterious theory.